At the height of his academic career, Al-Ghazali was the most respected scholar in the Islamic world. He had everything: fame, wealth, students flocking to hear him speak. Then something happened that made him abandon it all and disappear into the wilderness for 40 days of complete fasting. When he emerged, he was a completely different person. But what did he experience during those weeks of starvation? This isn't just a story about religious discipline or medieval asceticism. This is about what happens to human consciousness when you strip away everything: food, comfort, social interaction, even the basic securities of daily life, and confront the raw reality of existence itself. Al-Ghazali's 40-day fast became one of the most documented spiritual transformations in history, and his detailed accounts of what he experienced reveal secrets about the relationship between body, mind, and soul that modern science is only beginning to understand. Born in 1058 in Persia, Al-Ghazali had achieved everything a scholar could dream of by his mid-30s. He was the leading professor at the most prestigious university in Baghdad, consulted by rulers, revered by students, and considered the ultimate authority on Islamic law and theology. His books were bestsellers, his lectures packed auditoriums, and his opinions shaped religious thought across the Islamic world. But success came with a price. The more famous he became, the more Al-Ghazali began to notice a growing emptiness inside himself. He was teaching about divine love, but had never felt it. He was explaining the mysteries of spiritual union, but remained utterly separate from any direct experience of God. He was like a doctor who had memorized every medical textbook, but had never actually healed a patient. This realization hit him like a thunderbolt during one of his lectures. As he stood before hundreds of eager students, explaining the subtleties of divine knowledge, he suddenly felt like a complete fraud. How could he teach what he had never experienced? How could he guide others to spiritual realities he had only read about in books? The crisis deepened over the following months. Al-Ghazali found himself unable to speak during lectures. His throat would close up, his voice would fail, and he would stand there in silence, overwhelmed by the gap between his intellectual knowledge and his spiritual emptiness. His students were confused, his colleagues were concerned, but Al-Ghazali knew that something fundamental had to change. After 6 months of this inner torment, he made a decision that shocked the academic world. He resigned from his prestigious position, gave away most of his possessions, and announced that he was leaving Baghdad to seek direct spiritual experience. His friends thought he had lost his mind. His enemies celebrated his apparent breakdown. But Al-Ghazali knew that he had to discover for himself the realities he had been teaching about for years. The first phase of his spiritual quest involved intensive study with established mystics. But even this felt too intellectual, too removed from the direct experience he was seeking. He realized that he needed to go deeper, to strip away not just his external identity as a scholar, but his very dependence on the physical world itself. Is when he decided to undertake the 40-day fast, a practice recommended by ancient spiritual traditions, as a way to purify consciousness and open direct channels to divine reality. But this wasn't ordinary fasting. Al-Ghazali consumed nothing but water for 40 consecutive days. No food, no supplements, no concessions to physical comfort. He retreated to a simple cell, cut off all social contact, and dedicated himself entirely to prayer, contemplation, and the systematic dissolution of everything he had thought he was. Modern medicine would consider this extremely dangerous. After about 3 weeks without food, the human body begins to consume its own muscle tissue and organs to survive. Cognitive function typically becomes severely impaired. Most people would experience hallucinations, delirium, and potentially life-threatening physical complications. But Al-Ghazali's experience was the opposite of mental breakdown. His detailed journals from this period, written after he emerged, describe a systematic expansion of consciousness that proceeded through distinct stages. The first week was the most physically challenging. His body went through the typical stages of hunger, intense cravings, weakness, irritability, and obsessive thoughts about food. But Al-Ghazali used these physical challenges as opportunities for spiritual discipline. Every pang of hunger became a reminder to turn his attention toward divine reality. Every moment of weakness became a chance to surrender his will to higher guidance. During the second week, something remarkable began to happen. The physical hunger diminished, but more importantly, his mental chatter started to quiet down. The constant stream of thoughts, worries, plans, and intellectual analysis that had dominated his consciousness for decades began to fade into background noise. For the first time in his adult life, Al-Ghazali experienced what he called the silence of the mind. In this silence, he began to perceive subtleties of spiritual reality that had been completely hidden while his consciousness was dominated by intellectual activity. By the third week, he reported entering states of awareness that he had never imagined possible. The boundaries between his individual consciousness and universal consciousness began to dissolve. He experienced what mystics call unity consciousness, the direct perception that individual identity is actually an illusion, and that all apparent separation is simply different expressions of one fundamental reality. But perhaps the most significant transformation occurred during the fourth and fifth weeks. Al-Ghazali described experiencing direct communication with what he called divine guidance. Not voices or visions in the ordinary sense, but a clear, unmistakable inner knowing that provided answers to questions he had struggled with intellectually for years. This wasn't the result of hallucination or mental breakdown. Al-Ghazali's descriptions are remarkably lucid and coherent. He was able to distinguish clearly between different types of inner experiences, some that were obviously products of physical weakness or psychological projection, and others that carried a quality of absolute certainty and transformative power. Modern neuroscience has begun to identify some of the mechanisms that might explain Al-Ghazali's experience. Extended fasting triggers dramatic changes in brain chemistry, including increased production of neurotransmitters associated with enhanced awareness and spiritual experiences. The brain begins to operate on ketones instead of glucose, which can produce altered states of consciousness, similar to those achieved through intensive meditation. Research on long-term fasting also shows that the practice can trigger what scientists call neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to form new neural pathways and connections. This might explain why Al-Ghazali emerged from his fast not just spiritually transformed, but with enhanced intellectual abilities and creative insight. But Al-Ghazali understood his experience in spiritual rather than scientific terms. He saw the fast as a systematic process of purification that removed the veils between ordinary consciousness and direct divine awareness. The physical purification was just the beginning. As his body stopped processing food, his digestive system essentially shut down and entered a state of deep rest. This allowed enormous amounts of physical energy to be redirected toward mental and spiritual processes. The emotional purification was equally important. Cut off from all external stimulation and social interaction, Al-Ghazali was forced to confront every unresolved fear, desire, and psychological pattern that had shaped his personality. In the silence of his cell, with no distractions available, these inner conflicts rose to the surface and demanded resolution. But the most profound purification occurred at the level of identity itself. Day by day, as physical weakness increased, his attachment to being Al-Ghazali, the famous scholar, gradually dissolved. The ego structure that had defined him for decades began to fade away, revealing what he called the true self that had always been present but hidden beneath layers of social conditioning and intellectual accumulation. By the end of 40 days, Al-Ghazali reported a complete transformation of consciousness. He no longer experienced himself as a separate individual struggling to understand God from the outside. Instead, he had direct, immediate awareness of divine reality as the very foundation of his own being. When he finally broke his fast and returned to the world, people noticed the change immediately. His former intellectual arrogance had been replaced by profound humility. His scholarly explanations had given way to simple, direct teachings that touched people's hearts rather than just their minds. Most remarkably, he now possessed what his students called spiritual authority, the unmistakable presence of someone who speaks from direct experience rather than book learning. Al-Ghazali spent the rest of his life integrating what he had learned during those 40 days. He wrote extensively about the experience, but always emphasized that no description could capture the reality of what had occurred. The transformation had to be experienced directly. His teachings about fasting became influential throughout the Islamic mystical tradition, but he was careful to warn that such extreme practices should only be undertaken by people with proper preparation and guidance. The 40-day fast was not a technique to be copied casually, but the culmination of years of spiritual discipline and inner preparation. Modern people often ask whether such extreme fasting is necessary for spiritual transformation. Al-Ghazali would probably say that the external form matters less than the inner intention. The purpose of the fast wasn't to punish the body or achieve some kind of spiritual merit through suffering. The purpose was to create conditions where ordinary consciousness could be temporarily set aside, allowing deeper spiritual realities to emerge. Some contemporary spiritual teachers suggest that similar states of purification and transformation can be achieved through intensive meditation retreats, vision quests, or other practices that involve temporary withdrawal from ordinary social and physical comforts. But Al-Ghazali's experience remains unique in its documentation and influence. His detailed accounts of the psychological and spiritual stages of extended fasting provide a roadmap for understanding how consciousness can be systematically purified and expanded. Perhaps most importantly, his story demonstrates that authentic spiritual transformation requires more than intellectual understanding. At some point, the sincere seeker must be willing to surrender everything they think they know about themselves and reality, and enter into direct experience of the mysteries they have been studying from the outside. Al-Ghazali's 40-day fast wasn't just about giving up food. It was about giving up the illusion of separation from divine reality. It was about discovering that the God he had been teaching about for years wasn't a distant cosmic force, but the very essence of his own deepest nature when he emerged from that cell after 40 days. He hadn't just survived an extreme physical challenge. He had died to his old identity and been reborn as a living embodiment of the spirituals he had previously only understood intellectually. His transformation became a beacon for countless seekers who recognized that true spiritual authority comes not from accumulating information about God, but from the willingness to surrender everything in order to experience divine reality directly. Whether or not you ever undertake such extreme practices, Al-Ghazali's story poses a fundamental question. What are you willing to give up in order to discover who you really are? And how might your life change if you had the courage to find out?